The humid air of Cebu City wrapped around Manny Pacquiao like a familiar embrace as he stepped out of the black SUV. 28 years had passed since he last walked these particular streets, yet every pothole, every weathered building, every corner vendor seemed frozen in time. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, painting the neighborhood in shades of amber and gold that stirred memories he thought he had buried beneath decades of fame and fortune. Manny pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes, hoping to avoid recognition as he walked through the narrow alleys of Barangay Lahug. This wasn't an official visit. No cameras, no entourage, no security detail beyond the single bodyguard who maintained a respectful distance. This journey was deeply personal, triggered by a conversation 3 days earlier in Manila when a sports journalist mentioned seeing an old boxing coach still training kids in a rundown gym in Cebu. The name Edgardo had hit Manny like a perfectly timed uppercut to the chest. His first trainer, the man who had seen potential in a skinny, barefoot 12-year-old who could barely afford to eat one meal a day. The coach who had wrapped Manny's hands with torn cloth because proper boxing gloves were a luxury they couldn't dream of affording. As Manny navigated the familiar maze of streets, each step transported him back to those early days. He remembered running these same paths at dawn, his stomach growling with hunger, his feet tough as leather from years without shoes. The small sari-sari stores looked exactly the same, their corrugated metal roofs rusted by decades of tropical rain. Children played basketball on a makeshift court where the rim had no net, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls just as it had when Manny was their age. The old boxing gym stood at the end of a dead-end street, its faded yellow paint peeling like old skin. A hand-painted sign above the entrance read, "Villarreal Boxing Club," in bold red letters that had faded to a dusty pink. Through the open doors, Manny could hear the rhythmic thudding of gloves against heavy bags, the squeak of jump ropes against concrete, and the encouraging shouts of young voices. Manny paused at the threshold, his heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity he hadn't felt since his most challenging fights. 30 years had passed since he last saw Edgardo. The old coach would be in his 70s now, if he was still alive. Doubt crept into Manny's mind like smoke through cracks in a wall. What if Edgardo didn't remember him? What if the years had changed everything beyond recognition? Inside the gym, sweat hung thick in the air like morning fog. The equipment was ancient but meticulously maintained. Heavy bags patched with duct tape, speed bags that had seen thousands of hours of training, and a boxing ring with ropes that had been retied countless times. Young fighters moved through their routines with the same hunger and determination Manny remembered feeling at their age. An elderly man with silver hair and weathered hands sat on a wooden stool in the corner, wrapping the hands of a teenage boxer. His movements were precise and gentle, the muscle memory of decades spent preparing fighters for battle. When he looked up, his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that could spot technique flaws from across the room. Time seemed to freeze as recognition dawned on both men simultaneously. The teenage boxer continued chattering about his upcoming fight, oblivious to the moment unfolding before him. Other fighters paused their training, sensing something significant in the sudden stillness that had fallen over their coach. Edgardo's weathered face transformed as a slow smile spread across his features. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the roll of hand wraps, never breaking eye contact with the man who had once been his proudest student. The distance between them felt like an ocean, though only 20 feet of worn concrete separated the man who had become a global icon from the coach who had shaped his earliest dreams. Edgardo rose slowly from his wooden stool, his 73-year-old joints protesting after decades of demonstrating punches and holding mitts for countless young fighters. The teenage boxer, whose hands he had been wrapping, looked between them with confusion, sensing the gravity of the moment, but unable to comprehend its significance. Manny removed his baseball cap, and the recognition in the gym became immediate. Whispers rippled through the small crowd of fighters like waves across still water, but their voices seemed distant and muffled, as if the entire world had narrowed to just these two men who shared a history that transcended the sport they both loved. Edgardo took the first tentative step, his weathered face a canvas of emotions that had been 30 years in the making. Pride, joy, disbelief, and something deeper. A father's love for a son he thought he might never see again. Manny moved forward as well, each step carrying the weight of every championship belt, every sold-out arena, every moment of glory that had its roots in this humble gym. When they finally embraced, it was as if time collapsed entirely. 30 years dissolved into nothing. The older man's arms, still strong despite his age, wrapped around the shoulders that had carried the hopes of an entire nation. Manny felt the familiar scent of liniment and sweat that had defined his earliest memories of serious training. Edgardo's hands, rough from decades of working with leather and rope, patted Manny's back with the same gentle firmness he had used to encourage a scared boy who had walked into this gym with nothing but raw talent and desperate hunger. The embrace lasted nearly a full minute, and in that time Manny remembered everything. He remembered how Edgardo had found him sleeping on the gym floor one night because he had nowhere else to go. The coach had said nothing, simply brought a thin pillow and an old blanket the next evening. He remembered how Edgardo had shared his own lunch with Manny when it became clear the boy hadn't eaten in 2 days. Rice and dried fish had never tasted so good, and the kindness behind the gesture had meant more than any future championship could. He remembered the morning when Edgardo had noticed Manny's feet were bleeding from running on rough pavement without shoes. The coach had disappeared for an hour and returned with a pair of second-hand rubber slippers that were 2 sizes too big. But they were the first real footwear Manny had owned in months. The old man had claimed he found them in the gym's lost and found, but Manny had seen the price tag hastily torn off. Most of all, Manny remembered the day when a talent scout from Manila had offered to take him to the capital for better training opportunities. Edgardo had helped him pack his few belongings, never once expressing the heartbreak of losing his most promising student. Instead, he had pressed a small envelope into Manny's hands containing enough money for food during the trip. Money Manny later learned came from Edgardo's own savings. The gym around them had grown completely silent. Even the youngest fighters seemed to understand they were witnessing something sacred. Edgardo's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he finally stepped back, his hands remaining on Manny's shoulders, as if afraid the moment might prove to be a dream. Manny studied his old coach's face, noting how the years had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but how those same eyes still burned with the passion that had made him such an effective teacher. The gym behind Edgardo told its own story, equipment held together with determination and duct tape, walls decorated with faded photographs of former students, and a small shrine in the corner where candles burned for fighters who had passed away. This place had given him everything, and now Manny finally had the chance to give something back. As the initial shock of recognition settled, Manny found himself studying the gym with the eyes of both a champion and the hungry boy he had once been. Nothing had changed, yet everything was different. The same cracked mirrors lined one wall, their silvering spotted with age and humidity. The same heavy bags hung from chains that creaked with each impact, their leather surfaces worn smooth by countless gloves. But now Manny could see what had always been there, the love and dedication that transformed this humble space into a sanctuary for dreamers. Edgardo gestured for Manny to observe as he returned to his duties, wrapping the hands of young Vicente, a 17-year-old with the same lean frame and hungry eyes that Manny had possessed 3 decades earlier. The teenager's worn shorts and faded tank top told a familiar story of financial struggle, but his movements held the fluid grace of natural talent. Manny watched as Edgardo's weathered fingers moved with practiced precision, each wrap placed with the same careful attention he had given to Manny's hands all those years ago. The ritual was identical, the same methodical process, the same gentle corrections of hand position, the same quiet patience that had made Edgardo such an exceptional teacher. Manny remembered how those hands had felt like safety itself, how Edgardo's careful wrapping had been the difference between injury and protection for a boy who couldn't afford proper equipment. Around the gym, other young fighters continued their training routines. Ruben, a stocky 15-year-old, worked the speed bag with determination that reminded Manny of his own relentless pursuit of perfection. 2 younger boys, Isagani and Emil, took turns holding the heavy bag for each other, their small bodies straining against the weight, but never giving up. Their bare feet slapped against the concrete floor in the same rhythm Manny had once maintained during his own training sessions. What struck Manny most profoundly was the absence of any acknowledgement of their connection. Nowhere in the gym were there photographs of Manny's victories, no newspaper clippings celebrating his achievements, no shrine dedicated to the gym's most famous alumnus. Edgardo had never used Manny's success to promote himself or attract students. The old coach had simply continued his quiet work, shaping young fighters with the same dedication he had always shown, never trading on past glory. The realization filled Manny with a mixture of gratitude and regret. Gratitude for the humility and authenticity that had defined his first teacher, and regret for the years of silence between them. While Manny had conquered the boxing world, Edgardo had remained here, earning perhaps a few hundred pesos per month, training kids whose families could barely afford to eat, let alone pay substantial coaching fees. Manny observed how Edgardo moved among his students, offering gentle corrections and quiet encouragement. The coach's eyes held the same intensity they had possessed 30 years earlier, the same ability to spot potential in unlikely places. When young Vicente threw a combination that was nearly perfect, Edgardo's face lit up with the same pride he had once shown in Manny's achievements. The afternoon light streaming through the open doors cast long shadows across the training floor, creating a natural spotlight that seemed to illuminate the timeless cycle of mentorship occurring before them. Each young fighter represented someone's dreams, someone's hope for a better future, just as Manny had once represented those same dreams for his own family. As he watched Edgardo demonstrate a proper jab to a group of attentive students, Manny felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This place had given him everything, not just boxing skills, but character, discipline, and the foundation that had allowed him to handle success with grace. Now, after 30 years of taking from this well of knowledge and inspiration, it was time to give back. The question wasn't whether he should help, but how much difference he could make in the time he had available. Edgardo made a subtle gesture toward the boxing ring, inviting Manny to step closer to where a sparring session was about to begin. Two young fighters, Carlo and Jericho, were preparing for 3 rounds of controlled combat. Manny recognized the nervous energy in their movements, the way they bounced on their toes and adjusted their gloves repeatedly. He had felt that same mixture of excitement and anxiety countless times in this very ring. As the boys began their session, Manny found himself transported back to his own early sparring experiences. He remembered the first time Edgardo had allowed him to step between the ropes, how enormous the ring had seemed to his 12-year-old perspective. The canvas had felt like hallowed ground beneath his bare feet, and every punch had carried the weight of his family's hopes for a better future. Edgardo watched the sparring with the sharp eye of a master craftsman, occasionally raising his hand to stop the action and demonstrate proper technique. His movements, though slower than they had been 3 decades ago, still carried the fluid precision that had made him such an effective teacher. When he showed Carlo how to properly execute a left hook, his body remembered the motion perfectly, muscle memory overriding the limitations of age. Manny noticed how the other young fighters gathered around the ring to observe and learn. Their faces reflected the same hunger for knowledge that had driven him during his early training days. Among them stood Ariel, a thin 14-year-old whose technique showed raw promise despite obvious lack of formal instruction. The boy's worn shoes had holes in the soles, and his shorts were held up by a piece of rope rather than a proper belt. The sight stirred something deep in Manny's chest. He saw himself in Ariel's determined stance, in the way the boy studied every movement and absorbed every lesson. This was the cycle of boxing in the Philippines, poor kids with nothing but dreams and determination, guided by coaches who understood that they were teaching more than just punches and footwork. When the sparring session ended, Edgardo began working with individual students on technique. He paired up with young Enrico, demonstrating the proper way to slip a punch while maintaining balance for a counter-strike. The lesson was identical to one Manny remembered receiving at the same age, when his reflexes were raw, but his eagerness to learn was unlimited. As Manny watched, he began to notice subtle details that spoke to the gym's financial struggles. The boxing gloves were patched and repatched, held together by careful stitching and athletic tape. The protective gear showed years of hard use, and several of the training implements were clearly homemade. Yet despite these limitations, the quality of instruction remained exceptional. One by one, the young fighters began to recognize their famous visitor. Word spread through the gym in whispers and stolen glances, but the atmosphere remained respectful and focused. These boys had been taught discipline and respect by Edgardo, and they maintained their training intensity even as excitement rippled through their ranks. Manny watched as Edgardo worked with Thomas, a promising lightweight whose footwork needed refinement. The old coach demonstrated the same patient teaching methods that had shaped Manny's own foundation. Every correction was offered with encouragement, every mistake treated as an opportunity to learn rather than a reason for criticism. The afternoon was growing late, and golden sunlight slanted through the gym's windows, creating dramatic shadows that emphasized the timeless nature of the scene. This could have been any day from the past 30 years. The same dedication, the same dreams, the same unwavering commitment to excellence despite overwhelming obstacles. As Manny absorbed the familiar rhythms of the gym, he realized that his success had been built on more than just Edgardo's technical instruction. The old coach had taught him that greatness came from consistency, from showing up every day regardless of circumstances, from treating every training session as a sacred opportunity to improve. Now, surrounded by the next generation of dreamers, Manny understood that his unexpected return was more than just a nostalgic reunion. The training session was winding down as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting the gym in warm amber light. Edgardo moved among his students with the same gentle authority Manny remembered, offering final corrections and words of encouragement before they headed home to their families. The old coach's dedication remained unwavering, even as his body showed the accumulated toll of decades spent in service to others. Manny noticed how Edgardo favored his left knee slightly, a subtle limp that spoke of old injuries never properly treated. The coach's hands, once smooth and quick, now bore the gnarled evidence of arthritis, yet they still moved with surprising dexterity when demonstrating techniques. His breathing was slightly labored after extended periods of movement, but his eyes remained as sharp and focused as they had been 3 decades earlier. When young Joaquin struggled with his stance during heavy bag work, Manny found himself stepping forward instinctively. The muscle memory of countless training sessions flooded back as he gently adjusted the boy's foot position and showed him how to rotate his hips for maximum power. The correction was identical to one Edgardo had made for Manny countless times, and the irony wasn't lost on either man. Edgardo watched with quiet satisfaction as his former student passed on the same fundamental lessons that had shaped his own foundation. There was poetry in the moment, the teacher watching his greatest success become a teacher himself, the knowledge flowing through generations like water through connected vessels. As the younger fighters gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, Manny noticed the pride in their movements despite their obvious poverty. Their clothes might be patched and their shoes worn thin, but they carried themselves with the dignity that comes from pursuing something meaningful. Each boy thanked Edgardo with genuine respect before heading into the dusky evening, their voices echoing off the narrow alley walls as they walked home together. Soon, only Manny and Edgardo remained in the gym. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the weight of shared memories and mutual understanding. Edgardo began his evening routine, methodically organizing equipment and ensuring everything was prepared for the next day's training. His movements were ritualistic, performed with the same care he had shown every evening for the past 40 years. Manny joined in the familiar routine without being asked, stacking protective gear and returning gloves to their designated spots. His hands remembered the texture of the old equipment, the way certain pieces fit together, the order in which everything should be arranged. It was as if the 30 years between them had compressed into nothing, reducing them to their essential relationship of teacher and devoted student. As they worked together in companionable silence, Manny began to understand the true depth of Edgardo's sacrifice. The old coach had devoted his entire adult life to this gym and these students, asking for nothing in return beyond the satisfaction of watching young fighters grow and improve. He had never married, never accumulated wealth, never sought recognition for his contributions to the sport. The gym itself told the story of a man who had given everything to his calling. Personal comforts had been sacrificed to keep the facility operating. New equipment had been purchased with money that might have gone toward medical care or retirement savings. Every peso earned had been reinvested in the dreams of young fighters who saw boxing as their only escape from poverty. When they finished organizing the equipment, Edgardo moved to a small desk in the corner where he kept his training records. The ledger was a simple notebook, its pages filled with handwritten notes about each student's progress, fighting weight, and personal circumstances. Manny glimpsed his own name on a page dated 30 years earlier, the entry written in Edgardo's younger handwriting, but containing the same meticulous attention to detail. The sight of his name in that weathered notebook struck Manny with unexpected force. He was just one entry among hundreds, just another young fighter who had passed through these doors seeking transformation. Yet to Edgardo, he had clearly been special enough to remember, after 3 decades of separation. As darkness settled over Cebu city, the sounds of the neighborhood began to change. The laughter of children playing in the streets gave way to the clatter of cooking pots and the murmur of family conversations drifting through open windows. Inside the gym, fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting harsh shadows that made the space feel both smaller and more intimate than it had appeared in daylight. Edgardo moved to a small corner area that Manny hadn't noticed before, a modest living space sectioned off by hanging sheets. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. His old coach lived in the gym. A narrow cot, a small electric fan, and a plastic chair constituted the entirety of Edgardo's personal quarters. A hot plate sat on a wooden crate that served as both table and storage, surrounded by the basic provisions of a man who had chosen purpose over comfort. The sparse living arrangement spoke volumes about Edgardo's priorities. Every peso that came into the gym went toward equipment, utilities, and helping students who couldn't afford training fees. The coach's personal needs had been relegated to the absolute minimum necessary for survival. A single change of clothes hung from a nail in the wall, and his few possessions fit easily into a cardboard box beneath the cot. Manny watched as Edgardo prepared his simple evening meal, instant noodles and canned sardines, the same cheap combination that had sustained countless Filipino families through economic hardship. The sight transported Manny back to his own childhood, when such meals had represented feast rather than mere sustenance. The irony wasn't lost on him that while he now lived in luxury beyond imagination, the man who had started him on that journey continued to survive on the edge of poverty. On the wall above Edgardo's bed hung a small collection of photographs, not of famous fighters or championship moments, but of ordinary students who had passed through the gym over the years. Wedding photos, graduation pictures, and family portraits created a gallery of lives touched by boxing and transformed through discipline and dedication. Each image represented someone who had found direction and purpose within these walls. Among the photographs, Manny spotted a faded newspaper clipping from one of his early professional victories. It was yellowed with age and carefully protected behind a piece of cracked glass, positioned not prominently, but tucked among the other memories as if it were just another student's achievement worth celebrating. The humility of its placement moved Manny more than any grand display of his accomplishments could have. Edgardo's evening routine continued, with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. He checked the locks on the equipment storage, tested the electrical connections to ensure safety, and made notes in his training ledger about the day's sessions. Each action reflected decades of accumulated wisdom about maintaining a boxing gym on an impossibly small budget. The coach's dedication extended beyond mere facility management. Manny noticed a small notebook where Edgardo tracked the personal circumstances of each student, whose family was struggling financially, who needed extra encouragement due to problems at home, who showed promise that deserved special attention. The entries revealed a man who understood that coaching involved far more than teaching boxing techniques. As Edgardo settled onto his cot, with a well-worn paperback book, Manny realized the full magnitude of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a gym where boxing was taught. It was a sanctuary maintained by a man who had sacrificed everything personal for the sake of others' dreams. Edgardo had never married because the gym demanded his complete attention. He had never accumulated savings because every peso went toward equipment and student aid. He had never sought recognition because his satisfaction came from watching others succeed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, occasionally flickering in a way that suggested electrical problems that would eventually need expensive repairs. The building's foundation showed hairline cracks that spoke of structural issues requiring attention. Yet despite these mounting challenges, Edgardo continued his work with unwavering commitment, trusting that somehow the gym would survive another day, another month, another year. In that moment, Manny understood that he wasn't just visiting his old coach. He was witnessing the embodiment of pure dedication to craft and community. The night air carried the familiar sounds of Cebu, distant traffic, barking dogs, and the gentle hum of electric fans working overtime against the tropical heat. Manny sat on a plastic chair beside Edgardo's simple living area, watching his old coach read by the dim light of a single bulb. The book was a collection of boxing training techniques, its pages dog-eared and annotated, with handwritten notes that showed decades of study and continuous learning. In the quiet of the evening, Manny's mind raced through calculations that had nothing to do with boxing combinations. He thought about the cost of new equipment, building repairs, and proper living quarters for Edgardo. The numbers were simultaneously overwhelming and insignificant, a fortune by local standards, yet a fraction of what Manny earned from a single exhibition match. The weight of opportunity pressed down on him like a heavy training bag. Here was his chance to repay a debt that could never truly be settled, to honor the man who had shaped not just his boxing career, but his character. Yet Manny also understood that Edgardo's pride was as strong as his dedication. Any gesture of help would need to be offered with the same delicacy and respect that the old coach had shown him 30 years earlier. Edgardo closed his book and began his final routine of the evening, checking the gym one more time to ensure everything was secure for the night. His movements were slower now, each step deliberate and careful. Manny noticed how the coach paused occasionally to catch his breath, how his hand trembled slightly when reaching for light switches. The passage of time had taken its toll, yet Edgardo's spirit remained undiminished. The reality of the situation crystallized in Manny's mind with startling clarity. This wasn't just about upgrading equipment or improving facilities. It was about preserving a legacy that extended far beyond boxing. Edgardo represented something rare and precious, authentic dedication to others without expectation of reward. The gym was more than a training facility. It was a beacon of hope in a community where hope was often in short supply. As Edgardo completed his security check and settled back onto his cot, Manny made a silent decision that would change everything. The moment felt as significant as any championship fight, carrying the same mixture of nervousness and determination. But this wasn't about winning belts or proving his worth in front of thousands of spectators. This was about honoring the foundation upon which all his success had been built. The fluorescent lights clicked off one by one, leaving only the small reading lamp beside Edgardo's bed. In the semi-darkness, the gym took on an almost sacred quality, its humble equipment and worn surfaces transformed into monuments to persistence and faith. 30 years of dreams had been nurtured within these walls, and countless more awaited their turn. Manny understood that his unexpected return to Cebu had been about more than nostalgia or casual reunion. Fate had guided him back to this place at exactly the right moment, when he possessed both the resources and the wisdom to make a meaningful difference. The scared, hungry boy who had first walked through these doors was gone, replaced by a man capable of ensuring that future generations would have the same opportunities he had received. Tomorrow would bring conversations that needed to happen, decisions that required careful consideration, and changes that would honor both the past and the future. But tonight, in the peaceful quiet of the gym where everything began, Manny simply absorbed the profound gratitude that filled his heart like warm light. The circle was about to complete itself in ways he had never imagined possible. Dawn broke over Cebu City with the same golden light that had illuminated Manny's first training sessions 3 decades earlier. The gym stirred to life as Edgardo began his morning routine, unaware that this day would mark the beginning of a transformation beyond his imagination. Manny had spent the night on a spare mat, insisting on staying rather than returning to his hotel, wanting to experience once more the humble surroundings that had shaped his destiny. As the first students began arriving for morning training, Manny made his announcement through actions rather than words. He had spent the early hours making phone calls to Manila, arranging for contractors, equipment suppliers, and architects to visit the gym within the week. But his first gesture was simpler and more immediate. He handed Edgardo an envelope containing enough money to cover 6 months of operating expenses, presented not as charity, but as a long overdue training fee payment. The old coach's hands trembled as he understood the implications of what was happening. 30 years of sacrifice and dedication were finally being recognized, not with fanfare or publicity, but with the quiet dignity that matched Edgardo's own character. The envelope represented more than financial assistance. It was acknowledgement that the teacher's investment in his student had created value beyond measure. Throughout the morning, Manny worked alongside Edgardo as if he had never left. He held mitts for young fighters, demonstrated techniques that had won him world championships, and shared the same floor space where his own dreams had first taken shape. The students trained with extraordinary intensity, inspired by the presence of their hero, but more importantly by the example of mutual respect between teacher and former student. When the contractors arrived later that day, Manny outlined his vision for the gym's future: new equipment, improved lighting, proper ventilation, and most importantly, a comfortable apartment for Edgardo within the expanded facility. The renovations would preserve the gym's essential character while providing the resources necessary to train the next generation of champions. But perhaps the most significant change was the establishment of the Edgardo Villarreal Boxing Foundation, a program that would provide scholarships, equipment, and nutritional support for young fighters throughout the Philippines. The foundation would ensure that poverty would never again prevent talented youngsters from pursuing their dreams, just as Edgardo had ensured for Manny 3 decades earlier. As the afternoon sun slanted through the gym windows, Manny and Edgardo found themselves alone once again. The moment called for another embrace, but this one carried different emotions than their reunion. Where the first hug had expressed the joy of rediscovery, this second embrace conveyed gratitude, completion, and the promise of continued connection. In Edgardo's eyes, Manny saw not just pride in his former student's achievements, but satisfaction in knowing that his life's work would continue long after he was gone. The gym would survive and thrive, touching countless more lives with the same combination of discipline, hope, and unconditional support that had transformed a hungry street boy into a global icon. The circle was complete, but the story was far from over. In boxing gyms across the Philippines, young fighters would continue to pursue their dreams, guided by coaches who understood that they were teaching far more than athletic technique. They were nurturing the human spirit, one punch, one lesson, one act of faith at a time. The hug truly had said it all: past, present, and future united in a moment of perfect understanding.